You're welcome, everybody. I'm just making sure everybody knows we're here to hear from and talk and engage with Davarian Baldwin on rethinking the relationship between universities and urban communities. So just making sure sometimes there's mix-ups with Zoom sessions. So this is what we'll start in a moment or two once everybody's loaded up and into the space. Here. Okay, I think we should probably start the session, which will last between now and just before 5 p.m. So welcome, everybody. My name is Chris Olds, and I'm the host of the session today, and I'll make a few introductory comments and then explain the format for the session. It is being recorded, just so you know. And so it makes it much easier for people to follow up after if they were unable to attend our session. So I'm a professor in the Department of Geography at UW-Madison and also affiliated with the planning program. I'm a geographer and planner, originally from Canada. Happily discovered that Davarian had written about Winnipeg, which is where I was born. So I was mentioning just before we started that most people in the US don't know about Winnipeg. So it's great to sort of see that. In fact, your reference, Davarian, to Eastern European immigrants on page 202, that was my grandmother and grandfather from Poland. So
That's your story.
Yes. And Lloyd Axworthy is one of my memory names as well. So today's sponsor is the Institute for Regional International Studies, or IRIS, which is a national resource center funded by the Department of Education in Washington, D.C. And the IRIS NRC supports and enhances global awareness and inspires informed thinking about the complexities of our world. The IRIS NRC provides resources and expertise to K-12 and post-secondary educators as well, and tries to support students in the community at large. We also have a second co-sponsor today, the Havens Rights Center for Social Justice, which is co-sponsoring this event and a number of other sessions that Davarian is associated with. Essie Lenchner is running tech support. In at least my screen, Essie's in the upper left corner. If you have any challenges, please use the chat function to contact her. And again, we're going to be recording today's event and sharing the link and digital resources and a post-event email. You will only show, though, on the recording if your microphone is turned on to speak. And I like to remind people to put it on mute, please, while we're hearing, unless you want to speak and ask a question down the road. We have a land acknowledgement, which interestingly does tie in with some of the themes that were raised in Davarian's book, actually. And the University of Wisconsin-Madison occupies ancestral Ho-Chunk land, a place their nation has called Dejab since time immemorial. In an 1832 treaty, the Ho-Chunk were forced to cede this territory. Decades of ethnic cleansing followed when both the federal and state governments repeatedly but unsuccessfully sought to forcibly remove the Ho-Chunk from Wisconsin. This history of colonization informs our shared future of collaboration and innovation. And today, UW-Madison respects the inherent sovereignty of the Ho-Chunk Nation, along with 11 other First Nations of Wisconsin. And maybe there may be some questions again down the road in today's session about this aspect of the history of the university. So I'd like to introduce very briefly Davarian Baldwin. He is a leading urbanist, historian, and cultural critic with work that largely examines the landscape of global cities through the lens of African diasporic experience. Baldwin's related interests include universities and urban development, the main focus of today, the racial foundations of academic thought, intellectual and mass culture, Black radical thought and transnational social movements, the politics of heritage tourism, and 20th and 21st century art, architecture, and urban design. And I think this really does come through many of these themes, and most of them actually through the book itself. So the topic of today's session is rethinking the relationship between universities and urban communities, a key topic historically and contemporary sense now. This is always of interest to many, many people, and I think it's a great topic to focus in on. So the format today, Davarian will offer some introductory comments, perhaps read a passage. I'm going to ask some questions and have a little bit of dialogue to get things going, and then we'll open it up to Q&A time. And Q&A time can include sending messages through the chat space or sticking your hand up and seeking to ask a question and turning your camera on and your mic on. So please remember to turn your mic on if you do that. Okay, so it's now 4:10, so we'll pass it over to Davarian Baldwin, and we're thrilled to have you here. It was a fantastic book. Got lots of questions, but I'm going to bite my tongue right now.
Thank you so much, Chris. And I just want to say thank you for everyone taking time out to sit here and be in conversation around this work. I really appreciate your time and your engagement. I hope it will be a very fruitful conversation. So I just want to say it's great to be home. I was born and raised in Beloit, Wisconsin, an hour south of here. I went to Marquette University in Milwaukee, Wisconsin for undergrad and spent a couple of summers working at the Wisconsin Historical Society as an intern. So I know Madison relatively well, but it's been, 30 years, so that's quite some time. And then I went to receive I went to New York from there. And so in certain ways, whether it be Beloit or Milwaukee or Madison or New York, this story has been with me my whole life. This story about the relationship between universities and, in my particular case, urban development, but we could broaden the conversation to community development more significantly, more substantively. And so to start the conversation, I want to begin with the reading a passage or story from the book, if that's okay. That I think is relevant for those who are interested in space, geography, built environment, and universities. I spent some time today and yesterday looking all around Langdon State University. Some of these high rises, these out of scale high rises, were not even a thought 30 years ago. And so it's been quite dramatic to see the transformations of Madison from being a sleepy college town into turning into a first choice, second tier city, for reasons of affordability, for reasons of scale, which has had a profound impact on the long-term residents that live in neighborhoods like the Greenbush, or other neighborhoods to the south and the east of this downtown capital area spine, which I know very well, those neighborhoods, sometimes the invisible parts of Madison, we used to call Mad City 30 years ago. So I'm going to start with a passage. On October 25th, 2016, Columbia University held a dedication ceremony with great fanfare for the groundbreaking of its new Manhattanville campus. In his remarks, President Bollinger went as far to proclaim the project, quote, the best thing that could happen to Upper Manhattan. He specifically pointed out the number of public-facing services that now occupy the development, including a wellness center to raise health awareness and train community health workers, a science-based education lab, and a Wallach art gallery. The street-level feel of accessibility also includes publicly accessible Wi-Fi in the Steep Rock bouldering gym and the Harlem-based coffee shop and eatery Dear Mama. Ultimately, the campus buildings will sit along a pedestrian path running north from 125th Street to meet a 1-acre public square. But Columbia's new values of integration and transparency toward the community seem largely confined to the architecture. The ground floor amenities are all open to the public and are wrapped in a glassy skin, what principal architect Piano dubbed the urban layer, meant to blur the boundaries between public and university spaces. The buildings keep exposed their functional skeletons of air ducts and steel struts to suggest an integration of the campus into the neighborhood's rapidly fading industrial landscape. Piano went as far as to call the buildings, quote, new kinds of machines for doing scientific research, set within a factory of ideas. Still, this sprawling tribute to innovation also blocks Harlem off from a revitalizing 12th Avenue and the riverfront in ways that resurrect the ghost of 1968 and the failed attempt to partition Morningside Park for university desires. Since campus construction, restaurants along 12th Avenue, including the landmark Floridita, have suffered a 30% loss in revenue. And although Columbia has claimed that the project will enliven 125th, leading to the waterfront, this once public corridor is now largely owned by the university. And the new buildings are ensconced in what one journalist called a hostile architecture of security cameras, narrow benches, skateboard deterrents, and security patrols. Each gesture toward public accessibility further cemented Columbia's control over the neighborhood. The irony simmered beneath almost every celebration of the new campus. So hopefully this is a poignant passage to hold as we continue this conversation around campuses or universities' responsibilities to their host and surrounding communities. I like to use the word host instead of surrounding because especially as state universities, but also even private universities, their very existence is predicated on the existence of a state charter. And on top of that, their 501c3 nonprofit status is what gives the campus properties a property tax exempt status. Therefore, much of the prosperity that is seeded and celebrated on campus land, those what we love to see, many of us, those buildings of glass, those towers of glass and steel that suggest prosperity, that seems to just simply be self-generated by the innovations embedded within the university, are actually underwritten by the taxes, the suppressed wages, the policing that extracts wealth and capital from the host community, much more differently than a description of a surrounding community. That prosperity and profits go from one place to another. They don't just automatically appear. They come from somewhere. And much of this happens through financial and governmental arrangements that make such extraction possible. And this financial infrastructure is actually embedded within the brick and mortar, the streets, the pathways, the alleyways, the lakefront deterrents, thinking about Madison now, the built environment, the geography is what helped facilitate the flows of capital from city and community to campus. So the relationship here between history and geography and cultural logics are all embedded within telling the story. And in some ways, I felt that I was perfectly trained, born up to be able to tell this story, as having a background in American studies at NYU in a way that combined training in archival, cultural, and spatial analysis. My early work had been primarily archival, but as the introduction to the book demonstrates, I was actually in Chicago now 21 years ago. That time flies. 21 years ago at the famed Regenstein Library, an archive, doing traditional archival work. And I happened to step out for a lunch break and history hit me right in the face. It was at that moment on a blistery, wintry Chicago day, and I'm sure you all know those well, if only by rumor, but it's close enough to know them in person. I was struck by a protest where longtime South Side Chicago, red, black, residents to the north of the campus. So we're talking about Kenwood, Garfield, but also even Woodlawn to the south and other places were protesting. We're protesting because the university, which had for decades pushed retail away from the Hyde Park campus to make it primarily residential and educational. There, you can still maybe find T-shirts, vintage. Now I can say it would be vintage T-shirts with the phrase, talking about UChicago, the place where fun comes to die, because there was nothing to do but study. Because by design, the university had kept recreation and retail away from the main campus for the last 40, 50 years as a way to manage multiracial and multi-ethnic and economically diverse social interaction that sits all around the periphery of the Hyde Park regime, if you will. Hyde Park being the university campus neighborhood. So it was with great irony in a way that the university in 2003 had decided, first they had seen that their own students and faculty were leaving the main campus to go north to Bronzeville, historically Black neighborhood, to attend the Checkerboard Lounge. And they noticed that there were more and more interest in living in urban environments, but they did not have an infrastructure to build out to encourage retail and stewardship in their neighborhood. What marketing professors, scholars call leakage. That all the money was leaking out of the core area because there was no infrastructure to support the capture of capital in the Hyde Park neighborhood. So as a way to prevent or to stave off leakage, when the university noticed that everyone was going to the Checkerboard Lounge, they decided to purchase and relocate that lounge to their small, burgeoning Hyde Park campus neighborhood commercial corridor. So on that blistery, wintry day in 2003, in December, it was residents, longtime residents, who had thought about the Checkerboard Lounge as serving as the anchor for their own commercial development after years of both university and city divestment from Black communities, including a lack of parking in the neighborhood. They had believed that as people are starting to come back into the city, what we were calling the urban century, the back to the city movement of the early 2000s, that the Checkerboard Lounge would serve as their commercial anchor, as their what we call heritage tourism anchor. Ironically, the university claimed to have the same idea. And in fact, they used the language of Black historic preservation to justify why it was ethical for them to grab this lounge and put it as an anchor for their own commercial corridor. They argued that, well, and this is true, the lounge was not doing so well. It couldn't support parking. There was a water leakage in the building. But of course, the backstory is that some of the reasons why there was this divestment from that neighborhood is precisely because the university was not far away. It's precisely because the city didn't see the Black community as a site for investment. So they secondarily had a hand in the kind of disarray that was impacting that Bronzeville neighborhood. So they swoop in a strategic way and you talk about this is where my cultural analysis comes in. They swoop in and make the case that they're engaging in Black historic preservation. So on that day of protest, there were signs that read piracy and cultural theft. And as I began to watch this protest, I'm a researcher. I'm a scholar. So what did I do? I began to ask questions. What's going on? What does this mean? And then people began to tell me that the Checkerboard Lounge is just the tip of the iceberg, that the University of Chicago controls all of the South Side of the city. It is the governing force of the South Side. I was blown away by this statement. Even though I had gone to Marquette, I lived in Beloit with Beloit College. So this dynamic was actually all around me, but it was hiding in plain sight. And so it was this protest that pricked my consciousness. And I began to ask questions, and they were saying, no, it's not just Chicago Lounge. It's the fact that Chicago doesn't have a level 1 trauma unit at its hospital. It's the fact that the University of Chicago is the biggest low-wage employer on the South Side. It's the fact that the University of Chicago is the second or third largest real estate holder on the South Side. It's the fact that the University of Chicago Police Department is the second biggest private security force team in the world outside of the Vatican. It's all these things that begin to tell a broader story. So, I was obviously taken aback, to say the least. But then as I began to tell this story to other colleagues and friends, they're like, but yeah, of course, but look at USC in South Central. Look at Emory in SWAT, Southwest Atlanta, if you don't know what that means. Look at, look at Madison. Look at University of Wisconsin in Madison. Look at University of Florida in Charlottesville. Look at Johns Hopkins in Baltimore. Look at UPenn in West Philadelphia. Look at Yale in New Haven. The list goes on and on and on. Look at Wake Forest in Winston-Salem. Look at the University of Texas in Austin. Look at the University of New Mexico in Albuquerque. Look at the Arizona State University, and not just Tempe, but also in Phoenix and in Mesa, and in the West, and in West Phoenix. So the list went on and on and on. I was like, wow, okay, this is a story. This is a story. And because I went to graduate school at NYU, I was trained in American Studies, but you can't go to school in New York and not be an urbanist. And so, I was trained in Certeau and Lefebvre and Soha and all these spatial and Rosalind Deutsche, architectural scholars, geographers, spatial and analysts. But what I found, and still to this day, is that all of our scholars with these amazing skills, tools, were quick to turn their attention to the Middle East, maybe Europe, maybe not, an inner city neighborhood in one of these communities I just mentioned. But we're loath to use these skills and turn their attention back on our own institutions. That there was an unspoken firewall around using the very skills that we've all been trained and cultivated to do and apply them to our own environments. That this story had been hiding in plain sight since at least the 1960s. And I'm not claiming to be the first one to make this observation. Arnold Hirsch, the great urban historian, talked about Chicago in his book, Making the Second Ghetto, briefly. There are geographers and policy analysts who talk about the impact of universities on communities, called the work in anchor institution work, which is a subfield. But most of it is boosterish, about what universities can do, how they can revitalize communities in a very uncritical way. There had not been a book-length, quasi-scholarly examination of this dynamic after all these years. And some might argue, some have argued that I'm a bad academic because I had the nerve to take my skill set and apply it to my own institution. It's suicide. Why would you do that? But, I'm a kid that grew up in Beloit. My mother was a factory worker. My grandmother was a domestic in people's homes and at Holiday Inn. I wasn't trained in academia. And as you should know, that 60% of academics come from academic families, if you didn't know that. So I didn't have that unspoken pause to not turn my eyes inward. I was a bad academic. And in some ways, I've come to the conclusion that it required a bad academic to do this work, to follow the money, to follow the logic. Nowhere in me did I say, wait a minute, I can't do this because I'm an academic. I was like, I'm an urbanist. I'm trained in archival, spatial, and cultural analysis. This is what the data tells me. And that's important. But on top of that, in some of the early work that's been done in this area, in the policy realm, it's a lot of it is organized around big data. So either very big statistical data sets, policy analysis, legal statutes, et cetera. But what was lost in all this was the human scale. And again, having a grandmother that was a domestic, having a mother that was a factory worker, coming from working class community, coming from labor, coming from neighborhoods that were over policed. So let me just say, being Black, being working class. I knew, even if I didn't know this directly, I knew that the best way to tell the story about the university is by being guided by those who are most clearly and directly and consistently subjected to the power of the university. That means those who are policed by the university, those who work at the university, those who receive their healthcare at the university, those who either are housed by the university or are displaced by the university, those who are profiled by the university. It's in their experiences that we gain a better sense of what the university is. My great colleague, Christina Heatherton, has always said, if you want to understand the lessons learned at a university, look at its relationship to its surrounding community. That will tell you what that university is, what you will learn from that university, either directly or indirectly. I hold that phrase dearly. It was told to me after I wrote the book, but it further confirms the power of the kind of work that I tried to do in the book and I'm trying to do in the advocacy that came after the book. We talk about that in a minute if you like, if you talk about that. But real quickly, I'm sorry, just one last thing. So therefore, that's why this book, and you know, for those who are critical, this has been a hit. That it's anecdotal. It's not representative. I don't have a big enough data set. It's driven by over 150 interviews over a 20-year period. That is what drives this. That is the way in which the story is told. Now, don't get me wrong. There's policy work in here. There's archival data. There's correspondence from university records and city halls. All that's in here. And you won't see that because I decided to go with a trade press as compared to an academic press. And that was by design. Because I knew they would help me write the book in a way that would reach a broader audience. For those that are in academia, that means something because I already had tenure when I wrote the book. I had a book already with a university press that got me tenure because sometimes, I'm going to tell the truth, our faculty hate on us that do trade books, right? So I had my bona fides secured. This book had a different plan. It wasn't driven to be talked to. I wasn't trying to talk to other academics. I was trying to talk to community. And the greatest compliment that I received from the book is that a young brother who was just coming out of incarceration in Philadelphia said, I read your book. This is my story. I grew up in the shadows of Drexel and UPenn. But it's great that you're doing, because I have a research lab now, and its primary focus was to do archival data. The data that didn't make it to the book, it would be a clearinghouse for the data on universities and urban development, and it will be sharing with colleagues. And he's like, that's great, but brother, I need your advocacy. I need you to get here on the ground and use your data and your research to help us make substantive change. And I've gone on to do that. And we can talk about that later, but I just wanted to give you this backdrop about the book, how it came to be. Real briefly, it's 5 chapters. There's the introduction that I just talked about that tells a story about, how I came to the book and my conceptual framework of universe cities, which we can discuss in a minute. Then there's an overview chapter that kind of lays out the general framework of, housing, policing, healthcare, labor, endowments, all those things, the infrastructures. And then each chapter focuses on a different city. So Hartford, Connecticut, where I currently reside, New York City, Chicago, Phoenix, Arizona, and then the conclusion chapter, which focuses on solutions, urban futures, highlights Winnipeg, Canada. So just to give you a sense of the structure of the book, I purposely designed it to look at both big and small cities, small liberal arts colleges, public research one universities, private Ivy League universities. So I tried to get the full range of urban environments and school structures so that to anticipate the critique that it would be, you know, limited or too interested and not broad enough in range. So hopefully that's helpful. Hopefully that'll give us, you know, some things to begin to provoke conversation, to talk. I'm happy to have the conversation.
Great. That's a fantastic setup, Davarian, and it was wonderful to hear your voice and think about it vis-a-vis the text and how you write. And I guess that was my sort of first question. I mean, I teach a cities and development course, broadly defined. We read books. We, as I was mentioning, we talk to authors and so on. But one of the things I really appreciated was your writing style is very, I thought, effective in conveying key aspects of the relationship between universities and cities, especially universities and often marginalized communities. And the writing tone is not overly abstract and laden with too much jargon, but it's a very sophisticated, I think, analysis that captures aspects of power, structural change, the role of different organizations and agency and shaping the sort of spatial outcomes that we see, and built form too. Not many books actually can capture aspects of these social transformations and then built form as well. And I'll come to that a little bit later.
Thank you.
And I'm just curious to sort of help try to get things started off. Just, is this your natural writing style? Because not everybody has that capacity to actually speak this way, or it's a labor, a hard job to actually change and extract sometimes from utilizing overly abstract and often jargonistic language when writing texts. So is this the real you? And
it
you
is now.
mentioned the publisher too. The publisher was supportive, but maybe you could fill us in on, you know,
Yeah.
it's important when you think about cities and these types of issues. Why do certain texts exist, and why is there absence of voice or style analysis?
That's a great question. I mean, I think within urban studies, we tend to focus on built environment and policy.
Yeah.
I think that we could use a little jolt of focus on the human scale more. I think we all could benefit from that. I definitely think that the layering or the scaffolding of archive and culture and built environment comes out of my American Studies training. But the amazing push from my editor, who was a trade editor, was that, and I don't think I didn't even do it enough for her, but was to have the narrative be character driven, to be anchored in people. If they had their druthers, it would have been maybe 3 or 4 people that we continue to circle back throughout the entire text. I wasn't, at that time, I wasn't skilled enough as a writer to do that. And I asked, well, can the cities be characters? And that was the concession, that the cities in each chapter would serve as a character that would then run people throughout in those chapters. But a true trade press book would have had 3 or 4 main characters that would have run throughout the entire book that would stitch it together. I wasn't there yet. But my concession was to have the cities themselves be characters and to run figures throughout those chapters, and to show connections. So then, you know, as you know, each chapter is both a city and a university or two, but there's a key theme that runs through those chapters. So, like, for example, in Chicago, the key theme is policing. In Phoenix, the key theme is real estate. In New York, the key theme is urban governance. And in Hartford, the key theme is community engagement. And so that's the subtle theme. But again, because it's a trade book, the mantra over and over again haunting me was show, don't tell. So nowhere in the book are you going to see, in this chapter I will argue. Right? That's on purpose.
Yeah.
Because the trade press wants to sell books. And so their template is fiction or nonfiction journalism. So essay style journal. So that's the template. Again, I don't think I fully got there, but I definitely was pushed to get there further than what happened before. And that has become my chosen style of writing from going forward.
Oh, interesting.
I no longer have interest in publishing in academic journals where you have to foreground a literature review before you can actually get to an argument.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not saying I never will again, but at this point in my life, in this season of my life, that's not my interest.
Yeah. Interesting. That was fantastic response. I mean, on a related note, you mentioned American studies and your training in American studies.
Mm-hmm.
We have read in my course Janet Abeloukod's America's Global Cities book,
Yeah.
Chicago and New York and Los Angeles.
Right.
I knew her. I did an interview with her, and what was interesting is she's looking at some similar cities, but different cities than you. But really,
Yeah.
from the start of history through to at least the 1980s, and situating the development of these cities in the big, long world systems sort of context, and how
Mm-hmm.
the U.S. is integrated with the world economy and these cities unfold at different times and so on. But my students, especially the international students, loved her book, and
Yeah.
I'm sure they'll love yours because they viewed it as a way to learn about America from perspective, the United States.
Yeah.
And so it's a city, it's including a nearby city for us, Chicago. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so do you, I mean, to what in which way is this book a form of American studies?
Mm.
And when you think about trying to provide enough context on state, society, economy relations in the United States, like, do you want to reach an international audience for this as well? And how much
Yeah.
do you need to fill them in about planning and governance, the way that power works? And because it is the US is, well, it's many countries, but it's also a distinctive place too. So,
That's a great question. Yeah, I think that this book is much more American studies, is much less American studies in content than it is in form.
yeah.
And I'll explain what I mean by that. American studies methodologically, at least the way I was trained in it, and what we call Birmingham cultural studies. So this is like Stuart Hall, uh, uh, um, uh, Paul Gilroy, people of that ilk. Maybe the young people might not know who those people are, but a lot of the way you think is because of these people. The way you've been learned to write and teach is because of people like Stuart Hall. So that training, that there's a direct linkage between those actual figures and the way we did American cultural studies. So it's culture connected with political economy. So and let's be honest, Marxist and built environment. So political economy, culture embedded within space. That's the approach. And on top of that, different than many fields in the academy, we don't start with a methodology, whether that be policy, statistics, archive, uh, built environment, and then apply it, GIS, and then apply it to a chosen location. Our approach is that we start with the location, we look around, we talk, and we then figure out what methods are necessary to uncover the truth and the meaning of this experience, and we deploy them accordingly. And so that inductive versus deductive approach is a clear American studies, at least American cultural studies at NYU, signpost,
Okay.
calling card, if you will. And so that is what makes us American studies. And on top of that, again, I didn't use the phrase, but talking about materialist analysis, built environment, cultural studies, this is a story of racial capitalism. And what I mean by that is that the driving engine of both prosperity and exploitation is lubricated by the power of racial difference. It is racial difference that allows those in power to extract additional surplus labor, surplus value from labor and from land. That the very same land means something economically different if it was occupied by a white community versus a black community. That it can become a site of environmental toxins or university buildings if it's deemed an empty space. And it's Black bodies or brown bodies or working class bodies that can make or transform a fully populated neighborhood into being perceived as an empty space, as a space that needs to be saved. And hence the calling card for the university to come in and put buildings there as an act of salvation, as an act of public good. This is a story of racial capitalism.
Yeah, great.
But
great.
I don't say that.
Yeah, okay. Very, very excellent points. And thank you for the responses.